in the stories we tell. If you liked the story, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to support the channel. I was in my room organizing the Dowry ledgers when I suddenly heard the chirping of little sparrows outside. They were whispering that if I truly had money, it was a pity, because it would all belong to someone else later. They said I wouldn't have any dowry at all, because the second young master, Alistair, would use that money to marry the general's beloved daughter. Madame Fu, my aunt, had always despised my merchant background and planned to secretly swap the marriage. On the wedding day, she would have the bridal sedan carry me to the door of the sickly, frail man next door. If I didn't want to live out my days as a chaste widow, my only option was to bow my head and become Alistair's concubine. In the end, my dowry would still fall into hands of the Marquis's estate. My hand, flicking the beads of the abacus, suddenly froze. It was one thing for others to scheme against me, but to scheme against my money was truly unbearable. Had they forgotten that a merchant's daughter like me was meticulous about every single calculation? The sparrows continued to chirp, their topic shifting from my marriage to the banquet being held in the flower hall. I closed the ledger. My maid, Xian, brought in fragrant water and whispered, "Madame Fu and the Marquise are hosting a banquet for the general's daughter, Miss Isabel Yang. The second young master, Alistair, is also present." It seems someone was just plotting, and the sparrows on the branches heard everything. 3 days ago, I had gone to the mountains to sweep my father's grave. Upon returning, I discovered I could understand the language of birds and beasts. At first, I found it amusing, but I never expected to hear such filth today. I casually scattered a handful of pearl rice on the windowsill. The sparrows joyfully flew down to fight for food, chirping that I was both beautiful and kind, calling themselves my good omens. Just then Mumuju, Madame Fu's trusted servant, walked in. She gave a slight bow, her face full of arrogance, and said, "Today, Madame is hosting the young lady of the general's estate, but she lacks a suitable meeting gift. She sent me to fetch one." I let out a soft laugh, thinking to myself what a smooth talker she was. Xian, however, frowned and retorted sharply, "A meeting gift that requires my lady to give up her dowry. Is that asking or robbing?" Mumuju's face flushed red with anger. She glared at me and said, "Madame Fu is your blood aunt. She has raised and cared for you for so many years. Now it's just a meeting gift, how can you call it begging?" I laughed. I feed the sparrows a handful of rice and they praise me with pleasant words. Yet this Marquise's estate has leeched off me for years, and they still act high and mighty when they come to beg. Madame Fu intentionally waited until the guests arrived before sending someone to fetch the gift, clearly wanting me to deliver it myself so she could enjoy the spectacle. If that was the case, I would play along and ruin her show. I told Xian to bring out the Yangji jade bracelet, saying I would deliver it to my aunt personally. Despite Mumuju's desperate attempts to dissuade me, Xian and I walked confidently towards the flower hall. But as soon as we reached the entrance, we were blocked by a group of maids and matrons. They said the hall was filled with court dignitaries and that my humble status made me unfit to enter arbitrarily. I glanced at Mumuju, emphasizing, "If I cannot enter today, then neither will this jade bracelet." They were about to say more when a clear female voice rang out, asking why people were blocking the door. The speaker was a young woman in magnificent attire, Miss Isabel Yang herself. Standing beside her was the second young master, Alistair Fu, the fiancé I had been betrothed to since childhood. Alistair looked momentarily flustered and quickly explained, "She is just a cousin lodging in the estate." He then invited Miss Yang inside to escape the heat, simultaneously signaling for me to get out of the way. But I didn't budge. His expression grew increasingly awkward. Miss Yang chuckled, covering her mouth with a handkerchief, remarking that every great estate had a few poor relatives seeking refuge. I narrowed my eyes at her. Though it was our first meeting, I felt an inexplicable sense of familiarity, as if I had seen her somewhere before. Before I could think further, Madame Fu also appeared, strolling leisurely. She smiled and announced that the food was ready, inviting everyone to dine. Then she turned to me, calling me in her usual gentle tone to come and serve. But the sparrows on the roof chirped. "The wicked ones eat their fill, yet they make Selena serve them." One even shrieked, "Whoever needs to defecate, just aim for his head." I suppressed my laughter and reluctantly agreed. Inside the flower hall, the female guests were seated behind a screen, the banquet table laden with delicacies. I glimpsed a few familiar dishes, all precious foodstuffs that my own stewards had respectfully presented to me. Somehow, they had been secretly moved from my courtyard to this table. I was so angry I almost laughed. Despite this, Madame Fu praised me for being clever and sensible, saying it was fine for me to serve the dishes today. Miss Yang nodded politely and said, I must instruct my maid to clearly list my dietary restrictions for you. Madame Fu nodded with great tenderness, reminding me to memorize them carefully. The marriage between the two families wasn't even settled, yet I, a guest, was already being ordered around like a concubine. How could this be? I held my head high, walked to the table, and sat down. I smiled at my aunt and said, I was busy with the ledgers yesterday. The abacus beads were so heavy my hands ache. It is truly inconvenient for me to serve dishes today. Miss Yang let out a soft, mocking laugh and asked, what abacus beads are so heavy they could injure your hands? But in the end, if you don't want to serve, it doesn't matter. I tilted my head, glancing at the impassive face of Madame Fu, and my heart grew cold. That abacus was crafted from solid gold by my father when I was born. I weighed 5 jin and 3 lying, so the abacus weighs exactly 5 jin and 3 lying. It's fine for normal use. But recently, all the shops submitted their accounts at the end of the month. I sat for a whole day calculating, and my hands are completely exhausted. Hearing me state this so openly and ostentatiously, Miss Yang was clearly rendered speechless. She didn't say another word to me for the rest of the meal. Seeing her face turn ashen, I found my appetite surprisingly good, and even had an extra bowl of rice. The banquet soon concluded. As soon as the guests left, Madame Fu summoned me. I had expected she would have something to say. Her so-called difficult position today was just a ploy to make me recognize my place and retreat. Sure enough, Madame Fu first feigned distress, sighing over the difficulties of Alistair's scholarly path. Then she emphasized that General Yang was a powerful backing, and that Miss Yang and Alistair were of similar age, a truly perfect match. I raised an eyebrow. If I recalled correctly, Alistair and I had been engaged since childhood, yet she dared to speak such words. Madame Fu quickly waved her hand. That was just a verbal promise. There was no marriage certificate, no betrothal gifts. It cannot be considered real. She even claimed that years ago when my father was gravely injured, he entrusted me to her before his death. She said that although she once had the intention of forming a marriage alliance, Alistair was, after all, the son of a marquis and would inherit the title. How could he marry a woman with no background and no power as his principal wife? When my father was dying, he was unyielding. He recorded his entire fortune as my dowry, to accompany me into the Nanyang Marquisate. The Marquis's estate at that time was already a declining noble house. It was only thanks to that dowry that they managed to maintain their prestige to this day. Back then, they used the marriage contract as bait to lure my father into agreeing, and now they want to break the promise to climb the social ladder. Was there any good thing in this world they wouldn't try to snatch? I stood up slowly, looked directly into my blood aunt's eyes, and said calmly, in that case, the marriage agreement between myself and the second young master, Alistair, is hereby terminated. Madame Fu was stunned for a moment, then quickly grabbed my hand, her voice reproachful. You foolish girl, why don't you understand? Am I not negotiating with you? A girl like you, leaving the Marquis's estate, you'd be like meat on a chopping block. How could you hope to marry a decent man? It's better to be Alistair's concubine than to go out and suffer. You are my niece, and you've had feelings for Alistair since childhood. What's the difference between being a concubine or a wife? What's the difference? What respectable woman would give up the position of a principal wife to become a despised concubine? Furthermore, my father always said that the daughters of the Ru family do not become concubines. Years ago, when my aunt remarried, my father, out of familial duty, gave her his entire fortune as her dowry, helping her marry into the Marquis's estate with the status of a successor, turning a merchant's daughter into the madam of a marquisate. And today, this same blood aunt is advising me to become a concubine. Is that not ridiculous? The breakdown was inevitable. Madame Fu angrily spat harsh words, saying I was just a solitary orphan with no elders to arrange my marriage, and that sooner or later my life would be ruined. She then ordered the steward to guard me strictly and forbid me from leaving the estate. Leaving was, of course, what I wanted, but not right now. First, the court does not allow women to establish their own households. If I couldn't resolve my household registration, I couldn't leave the estate. Second, there was something in this estate I still needed to investigate. My father died when I was only 10. At that time, he was a renowned imperial merchant in the capital, with a vast fortune, yet he died under mysterious circumstances. My father was a famous imperial merchant who always traveled with a large entourage of guards. But on his way back to the capital, he was ambushed by assassins. Both he and his carriage fell into a deep ravine. When he was rescued, he was already dying, barely clinging to his last breath as he entrusted me to my aunt with his final breath. The capital prefecture investigated thoroughly for a long time but found nothing, and the case was eventually forgotten. All these years, I have held this grief in my heart, unable to let it go, always investigating silently in the shadows. But the bandits from that year vanished like rain into a stream, leaving no trace. I had no choice but to change direction and follow the trail of those who benefited from my father's death. The first person I suspected was the Marquis of Nanyang. After my father passed away, the Marquis's estate, thanks to my enormous dowry, transformed itself. It not only covered years of losses but also regained its former aristocratic splendor. Although I was reluctant to suspect my own relatives with such cynicism, today, when my aunt uttered the words, "Want me to be a concubine?" the last shred of kinship between us was severed. On the way back to my courtyard, I ran into Alistair Fu, who was rushing over, his face filled with guilt. "What just happened was my fault. You can scold me if you want." He was still just as he was in childhood. His eyes would turn red whenever he got agitated. I sighed softly, saying he didn't need to blame himself. The person who called me a poor relative was just an outsider. Besides, Miss Yang would be his wife in the future. It was only natural for him to side with her. Alistair's expression changed. "You know," I nodded slightly. How could I say my heart was completely unmoved? Since I was 10, I had known my cousin was my future husband. He was gentle and kind, the only person in this estate who always treated me with genuine affection. I used to dream of walking along to him for life, growing old together. Yet today, he said, "Selena, even if Isabel enters the family, she can never surpass you. In the eyes of others, you may be a concubine, but in my heart, you will always be the principal wife." I looked at his expectant gaze, my heart as cold as ice. The person me was no longer the person I once knew. I replied calmly, "That won't be necessary, second young master. I have already made it clear to Madame Fu. From this day forward, the engagement between us is over." Alistair was stunned. He muttered, "You're insane. If you don't marry me, who else can you marry? Isabel is the daughter of the general of Junhai. You are just an orphan. How can you compare to her?" I looked at him silently. All the resentment pent up in my heart suddenly dissipated like smoke. He looked regretful and stammered, I was too agitated, don't mind me." But I had already taken a few steps back, putting distance between us. I spoke slowly. "I will absolutely not be a concubine. My father taught me to have self-respect and self-love, to only marry someone who treasures and protects me. If I cannot find such a person, it is fine not to marry at all. These are not things the second young master needs to worry about. From now on, farewell." With that, I hurried back to my courtyard and shut the door, locking Alistair outside. A door closed, like a curtain falling, cutting me off from the past. I stood in the courtyard for a long time, so long that the tears at the corners of my eyes were dried by the wind. Suddenly, 2 sparrows zipped past my face, chirping, "Scared me to death, scared me to death. Over by the sickly man's place, there's someone who can fly. Almost hit us birds." Another one chimed in, "Nonsense, people don't have feathers, how can they fly?" Then a myna bird appearing from nowhere, swooped past. The myna, with a cold and arrogant air, tossed out a remark, "That's Kingong, a lightness skill. What would you flapping birds know about it?" I suddenly came to my senses. The Nanyang Marquisate, though prestigious in name, had limited power. How could it afford to keep a hidden master? How could someone who knew Qinggong appear in this estate, and in such a neglected corner? The sickly man the sparrows mentioned was the eldest son, Ronan Fu, the son of the Marquis of Nanyang and his deceased first wife. His mother died in childbirth, and after Madame Fu remarried into the estate, she paid him little regard. Everyone in the estate, from top to bottom, treated him with indifference, almost like an outsider. It was said that Ronan's health was extremely poor, and he rarely appeared in public. The last time I saw him was at the Spring Festival banquet. At that time, he was coughing so violently it was painful to watch. I had Siyan send over medicine and some silver fragments. Unexpectedly, not long after, the silver was quietly returned, with a box of pastries placed beside it. A person like that was connected to a Jiang master. It was precisely because of my intuition, and my desperate need for an opportunity that I believed, without hesitation, he must be hiding something. Ronan's courtyard was in a remote corner of the front estate, quiet and desolate, its main gate shut tight. I hid behind a tree, observing quietly. Just as I looked up, I heard a bird exclaim from the tree, "Oh my, someone is growing out of the osmanthus tree." I instinctively looked up, but before I could see clearly, a sharp pain struck the back of my neck. My vision went dark and I lost consciousness. When I awoke, my ears were ringing, and I heard two voices arguing. "Did you get your head slammed in a door? Why did you capture her? How was I supposed to know she's your cousin? She was sneaking around like a cat, yet she still spotted me. This woman's skills are not simple. You're lying to me. Did you buy your position as a guard with silver? It's true, stop doubting." I hadn't even moved, and she looked right up at where I was hiding. "Fine, whatever, you clean up this mess. Your cousin, you handle her. His Highness, the Crown Prince, is still waiting for my report on collecting the silver. I don't have time for this." The sound of a door closing echoed with a crisp clack, and the room instantly fell silent. My mind was reeling, but I forced myself to remain calm on the surface. A guard of His Highness, the Crown Prince. This quiet, unassuming eldest young master, Ronan, was connected to the Crown Prince himself. The thought struck me like thunder. If I could get help from this person, could my father's mysterious death finally be brought to light? I immediately snapped my eyes open, meeting the probing gaze of Ronan. He startled and stumbled back several steps, almost hitting the wall. He quickly held his hands up in front of him. "Miss Selena, I mean no harm. Please don't be afraid." I rolled smoothly off the bed into a sitting position, my eyes locked on him. I saw his lips pressed tightly together, his face pale. He looked even more frightened than I was. "You fainted outside the courtyard. I carried you in?" I narrowed my eyes, skeptically examining his slender frame. "With a body like that, you carried me." Ronan stood frozen for a moment, then quietly straightened his posture. His shoulders were broad, his waist lean and firm. The black robe he wore stretched taut, clearly outlining his physique. It wasn't carrying, it was holding. While holding me, he also banged my head on the doorframe. I'll remember that for the rest of my life. Two sparrows, who had perched on the window curtain at some point, chirped. He held her. Yes, he held her. Only then did I remember the dull ache on my forehead. I was about to reach up and touch it, but Ronan flusteredly blocked my hand. "Don't touch, I just applied medicine." Seeing his clumsy demeanor, I looked up at his face again. Although he bore little resemblance to his cousin, Alistair, his aura was clearly not simple. The more I looked, the more refined and handsome Ronan's features appeared. The corners of his eyes tilted up slightly, and his gaze shimmered like autumn water, holding a hidden, gentle warmth. I pondered for a moment, finally deciding to take a gamble. I spoke. "The words exchanged between you and that man just now. I heard everything. Who exactly are you?" Ronan's expression immediately turned icy, his eyes filled with vigilance. But he couldn't maintain his defensive posture for long, because I had already taken him to the storehouse. The guard who knocked me out had mentioned, "His Highness, the Crown Prince, is in urgent need of silver." I casually opened a wooden chest, pulled out a ledger, and flipped it open. Tucked between the pages were thin gold leaves, as delicate as cicada wings. "This is the profit my stewards have brought me over the years. I have always hidden it this way. I do not have much, only an abundance of silver." I told him I could help them, on the condition that they help me find the person who murdered my father. Ronan tried to hide the astonishment in his eyes, asking, "Are you truly willing to offer this silver to the Crown Prince, without even knowing what it will be used for?" I smiled and cut him off. "As a commoner, to be able to contribute to His Highness is a great honor. Countless merchants in Jiangnan yearn for such an opportunity and never get it. Why should I hesitate? Besides, the court uses silver to raise armies and protect the nation. Where that silver goes, I do not care, nor do I need to. The empire belongs to him, my small contribution is insignificant. If I dare to trade, I must dare to take risks." Ronan did not agree immediately. But 2 days later, a man in black clothing came silently, giving me an iron token and an address. I immediately ordered my stewards to take the ledgers and the chests of silver to the designated location, nearly emptying all my accumulated reserves. Sayan saw this and was extremely worried. "My lady, if you do this there will be nothing left of your dowry." I raised a hand to stop her, replying coolly, "It doesn't even matter if I still have a marriage agreement. Right now, the most important thing is to find the culprit. The assets my father left me were not jewels and silver, but loyal stewards and a strong network of connections. As long as they remain, the silver, once spent, will return. After the storehouse was empty, my informants outside immediately brought the latest news from the capital. The most prominent was the matter of the general's estate marriage. The general of Junhai, Yang Bunyan, had achieved numerous glorious military victories and was just summoned back to the capital by His Majesty to assume a new post, making him the most sought-after figure in the city. Many noble families intended to propose a marriage alliance, but unexpectedly, he chose the Nanyang Marquisate, an estate that had already seen its decline. There must be a reason for such an anomaly. I immediately ordered a thorough investigation into the Yang family's internal affairs. The commotion in my courtyard, of course, could not be hidden from Madame Fu. Seeing my stewards frequently entering and leaving my courtyard, she panicked, thinking I was truly preparing to move out. She hurriedly summoned me, cried for a while, claimed she had been possessed or momentarily confused, and begged me to act as if the marriage discussion had never happened, and to continue with the engagement. I understood perfectly. Madame Fu saw that the plan to make me a concubine had failed, so she intended to drag things out while she plotted something else. Soon, the Duangwu festival was approaching. The Nanyang Marquisate always held a grand banquet on this occasion, the second most important event of the year after the spring banquet. Every year, I would instruct my stewards to bring the finest products from my shops to the estate to maintain the Marquis's prestige. But this year, despite Madame Fu sending people to drop hints, I pretended not to understand. Finally, unable to bear it any longer, Madame Fu came to my courtyard personally. With a strained expression, she said, "Selina, this year's Duangwu banquet is lacking bird's nest and shark's fin. I sent someone to the shop to buy them, but they were told you have none. How can it be that in a city this large, such things cannot be bought?" Madame Fu's face grew increasingly unpleasant. She began to interrogate me. "Are you still angry about the engagement? I am your elder. I have already admitted my mistake and explained everything. Why must you keep haggling over every little detail?" I quickly denied the accusation, saying that the shop steward had reported that there were floods in the south, and the goods could not be delivered. How can I be blamed for holding a grudge over the engagement when I cannot deliver the goods? Madame Fu then questioned me. "Then what about the servants' uniforms? Why haven't those been delivered on time?" I sighed and replied, "As I said, there are floods. Cotton cloth also comes from Jiangnan. There are shortages everywhere, it cannot be helped." Just then, the Marquis's own steward arrived, saying, "Cousin Selina, the Siua paper and the inkstones the Marquis regularly uses. The shop reports they are also out of stock." I was still trying to think of an excuse when the lark in my room suddenly shrieked, "Floods! Floods!" Madame Fu's face darkened, and she stormed off in anger. I heard later that Madame Fu was forced to use her own silver to cover those expenses. The dowry she brought with her all those years ago was not small. Did she really expect to not spend a single coin, and demand that I be the one to pay for the estate's prestige? The Duangwu banquet proceeded as scheduled. Isabel was, of course, the guest of honor, surrounded by the madams and young ladies of various estates, all trying to curry favor. Madame Fu never left her side, her face beaming with pride, wishing she could announce to the world that Isabel was about to become her daughter-in-law. Seeing this, a strange feeling rose in my heart. If Madame Fu was so desperate to ally with the Yang estate, why did she still dare to force me to be Alistair's concubine? Wasn't she afraid that Isabel would find out and cause a scene? Or had they already reached some sort of agreement? I suppressed my doubts and quietly found a peaceful corner to feed the birds. The banquet was held by the lake, with male and female guests seated on opposite sides, facing each other across the water. From a distance, I saw Ronan. Lately, he had been like a phantom, frequently absent from the estate. Ronan seemed to spot me as well. He quickly turned, stumbling awkwardly in the other direction, causing the sparrows in the trees to chirp. That sickly man's arms must be borrowed. Why is his face so red? So stupid. That's embarrassment. The birds chirping made me want to laugh. But as I was listening, the whole flock suddenly took flight in a panic. "Selina, move." At the same time, a strong gust of wind rushed me from behind. I instinctively dove forward, barely avoiding the worst of it, and then immediately dropped to the ground, feigning unconsciousness. From the corner of my eye, I clearly saw my attacker. It was none other than one of the brutish matrons from Madame Fu's courtyard. She was large and strong, hoisting me onto her back with effort and walking straight off. Ever since the attack by the Imperial Guard, I had asked my stewards to prepare a few items for self-defense. Therefore, even as I was being carried away, I wasn't worried for my own safety. But the birds were terrified, squawking loudly. Help, help! These people are all idiots. Can't any of them understand us? Selena, wake up! They followed me all the way to a guest lounge. I immediately understood their plan. They wanted to use the eyes of the guests to stage an incident between me and Alistair, then use it as an excuse to force me into submission. Sure enough, after the matron placed me on the bed, Alistair entered the room, and the door was quickly shut behind him. In the quiet room, only the sound of his heavy breathing could be heard. He paced back and forth, finally stopping by the bed. Selena, he said. In my heart. It has only ever been you. Don't be angry with me. I didn't want this either, but I truly have no other choice. I kept my eyes closed, listening as his breathing drew closer and closer. Rage flared inside me. Just as he was about to touch me, I shot upright. Second young master, what do you think you are doing? Alistair had no time to react. He scrambled back in panic, nearly falling to the floor. Why are you still awake? I looked at him coldly. Was I supposed to wait until after you had ruined my reputation to wake up? His face was pale, cold sweat beading on his forehead, and his voice trembled. No, it's not like that. Selena, after all these years together, you can't just abandon me. I gave a cold laugh. I never knew his tongue was so silver. It was clearly his entire family who abandoned righteousness for profit, yet now they twist it to make me the heartless one. I tightened my grip on the hidden weapon in my palm, my eyes watching him warily. He was about to take another step when, the door was suddenly kicked open. Ronan burst in, a red burn mark on his face, looking. A flock of sparrows swarmed into the room behind him, chirping wildly. Selena, we're here to save you. This sickly man is really capable. That was me. I'm the one who told him. Hearing this, a heavy weight lifted from my heart. I never imagined that just by giving them a few grains of rice, these tiny creatures would protect me so fiercely. Are you all right? Ronan asked, panting heavily. He had clearly run all the way here. His gaze fell on Alistair, and then we both froze. Alistair was sprawled on the floor, foaming at the mouth. I looked down and realized the hidden weapon in my hand had been triggered at some point. Ronan stammered. Hey, he's not dead. I started, then quickly shook my head. No, he's not dead, just unconscious. The weapon contains a narcotic, not enough to be lethal. Ronan let out a breath of relief, and immediately helped lift him onto the bed. You should leave quickly. I'm afraid people will be drawn here soon. Their goal this time was to stage a scene of you and me in a private room, and let everyone witness it, forcing me to bear the reputation of being unchaste and thereby forcing me to marry as a concubine. In just a few moments, Madame Fu will surely lead the crowd of guests here. Looking at Ronan's tall, thin back, an idea suddenly struck me. Madame Fu had previously tried to swap the marriage. Now that the engagement between Alistair and Isabel was set, the swap was impossible. In that case, I might as well sever her intentions right now. Ronan, tidying up the room, looked at me suspiciously. Why haven't you left? I observed him from head to toe, then suddenly broke into a brilliant smile. Eldest young master. His face immediately flushed red. He stammered. Why? Why are you asking that? Of course not, I answered for him. Then, is there someone in your heart? No, not that either. In that case, perhaps I can negotiate an exchange with you. When Madame Fu arrives later, we will simply say that we are engaged, and that we are mutually devoted. If you agree, I am willing to offer an additional 30,000 liang of silver for the crown prince. If that's not enough, then 50,000. Ronan raised his hand as if to refuse, but then slowly shook his head. I thought he wanted to negotiate further and was about to raise the price, but then he spoke. All right, I agree, but marriage is not a child's game. Will you not regret this? I glanced at Alistair, lying unconscious on the bed, and laughed softly. Even as a game, it is better than becoming his concubine. Ronan looked at me deeply, his expression complex, making it difficult for me to guess his thoughts. Just then, a commotion erupted outside. I quickly moved close to frame him. Despite his lean frame, he was still a full head taller than me. When the guests flooded the room, he needed only to tilt his body slightly to completely shield me behind his back. Madame Fu entered, her face feigning surprise, but when she saw Ronan, the one person who should not have been there, her expression changed and her voice shot up. Why are you here? Where is Alistair? From behind Ronan, I peeked out, smiling calmly. Honorable Aunt, my cousin Alistair fainted for some unknown reason and has not yet woken. I fear he drank too much, I replied calmly, then turned and continued. My eldest cousin Ronan and I came here together to check on cousin Alistair's condition. Madame Fu's eyes were dark, darting back and forth between me and Ronan. Just as she was about to speak, I quickly interjected. Honorable Aunt, I know that for my eldest cousin and I to meet in private is against etiquette. Although we are engaged, we are not yet married, after all. I hope you will not blame us. We were simply truly worried about cousin Alistair. Engaged. Madame Fu's face turned pale, her voice as cold as frost. Where did this engagement come from? I smiled faintly, raising my head to meet the curious and scrutinizing gazes of the crowd. My father was the imperial merchant of Chang. Before his passing, he entrusted me to the Nanyang Marquisate, to be married to a son of this estate as his principal wife. If there was no engagement, why else would I bring my entire vast fortune into this house? I glanced at Madame Fu, seeing a flicker of panic in her eyes. I continued, this estate has 2 young masters. The second young master, Alistair, is now engaged to the young lady of the young family. Therefore, the engagement must naturally be with the eldest young master, Ronan. Isn't that right, Aunt? The madams and young ladies in the room were all veterans of the inner court. How could they not see the drama unfolding? Immediately, someone spoke up to mediate. Oh, it is just an engaged couple meeting privately. They haven't done anything improper. Why be so harsh? Indeed, the second young master appears to be drunk. Someone should call a physician, lest his health suffer. So, the young miss is betrothed to the eldest young master. In that case, this estate truly has double happiness gracing its doors. Madame Fu gritted her teeth, her forced smile uglier than tears. I looked at her coolly, thinking to myself, the real show is yet to come. Ever since that farce at the Duangwu banquet, I cut off all business dealings with the Marquisate. Previously, all the estate's shops sourced their goods from my businesses to resell, often buying on credit and running at no profit. Not to mention the daily supplies for the estate, which everyone had grown accustomed to taking and using freely. Now, suddenly cut off from the source, the estate fell into chaos. Duangwu was long past, but the servants were still wearing their thick spring clothes. The kitchen had nothing to cook, resorting to dried goods and pickled vegetables for days on end. Some of the maids and matrons, likely instigated by others, thought I was deliberately making things difficult. They stood outside my courtyard, shouting veiled insults. Sai Yan was indignant. They are too outrageous. Taking advantage of you wasn't enough. Now that they can't leech anymore, they turn to blaming you. Don't be angry. A sparrow chimed in. Just watch me drop a load on them. That'll fix their faces. I eat a lot, so I drop a lot. By now, the birds didn't just perch in the courtyard. They flew right into my room, landing next to my abacus as I worked. I smiled, unbothered. As long as I knew the estate was not living peacefully, my heart was at ease. I bribed the matron in charge of the storage and secretly retrieved all the estate's ledgers from the past few years to examine them. As a merchant's daughter, I am most sensitive to money. I had vaguely sensed irregularities in the accounts before. Now, after careful cross-referencing, I discovered that nearly 100,000 lying of silver had vanished into thin air. Recalling Madame Fu's greedy and anxious demeanor, I understood what she was afraid of. That afternoon, I disguised myself and left the estate to meet Ronan at a tea house. He had sent a letter the day before, saying there was progress in the investigation. As I reached the entrance, I saw the Marquisate's carriage. Madame Fu and Isabelle stepped out and entered the tea house together. Isabelle held Madame Fu's arm affectionately. Their intimacy resembled that of a mother and daughter, not a future mother-in-law and daughter-in-law. A strong suspicion suddenly arose in my heart. I told Si Yan to investigate while I quickened my pace to follow them. They chatted happily as they walked, finally settling into a private room in a corner of the second floor. Just as the door closed, I faintly heard a man's voice inside. I heard a male voice coming from the room, and it sounded slightly familiar. When I met Ronan afterward, I got straight to the point. Years ago, when Alistair was born, was your father in the estate? Ronan frowned slightly, thinking, and then replied, I was only 4 years old then, and my health was poor. Father had taken me to the Hugo Temple to pray for blessings. When he received the news, he rushed back. By that time, Alistair had already been born. A suspicion grew in my heart, but I didn't press further, instead shifting to the investigation's progress. Ronan said gravely, Uncle's death might be connected to an old case, which is currently being overseen by the Crown Prince himself. It will require more time to investigate. Hearing this, I couldn't help but remember the hesitant demeanor of the head steward years ago. When my father died, I had long suspected this matter was not simple. I never expected the Crown Prince himself to be involved. It showed how significant this case was. But I have already waited 7 years. What is a little more time? Ronan lowered his gaze slightly, sitting quietly for a moment. Then, suddenly, his face flushed red, and even his neck turned crimson. I couldn't help but look at him more curiously. His thick eyelashes trembled slightly, his gaze averted. That shy appearance made me want to tease him. I smiled and gently uttered 2 words, "Future husband." Ronan visibly jolted, his eyes widening as if I had said something earth-shattering. I felt a pang of regret and quickly corrected myself. That was presumptuous of me. The little mynah bird still perched on my shoulder suddenly squawked. Goodness, his heart is beating even faster than mine. Ronan abruptly stood up, intending to leave. But after 2 steps he turned back and said in a low voice, "The 9th day of the 10th month is an auspicious day according to our birth charts. If you don't like it, I will find another day." He finished speaking and fled. I watched him go, and laughed, thinking to myself, could he really be planning to turn our pretense into reality? From that day on, Ronan began to avoid me. Even when there was news, he would only send someone to deliver it, resolutely refusing to meet. Although he didn't appear, I still had my flock of loyal informants. The sparrows chirped and reported his movements to me every day. The sickly man stood outside the courtyard for a long time but wouldn't come in. The sickly man is cleaning his courtyard. He even hung up a swing. Birds get married and build nests. The sickly man is getting married soon too. I chuckled, gently pinching one of the birds, perched nearby. Alright, stop calling him the sickly man, it isn't nice. I scooped up some melon seeds onto a jade tray, stuffing the little chatterboxes' mouths. They immediately grew noisy again. It's done for, it's done for. Selena has fallen for the sickly man. I am still reviewing the ledgers, do not disturb me. I had just shooed the little imps away when Siyan rushed in from outside. My lady, I have returned. I had previously sent her to her hometown to gather information. I hadn't expected her back so soon. Just as I was about to ask for details, a commotion erupted outside. I stepped out to see what it was, only to find Mumu Ju leading a group of matrons, carrying numerous large jars. Cousin Selena, the young master of the estate, is preparing for his wedding. Madam has sent people to repair the courtyard walls and give everything a fresh coat of whitewash. I replied coolly, since when has Madame Fu become so benevolent? That will not be necessary. I had this courtyard repaired myself just 2 years ago. When I first arrived at the Nanyang estate, this courtyard was dilapidated and ignored by everyone. It was desolate, and I used my own funds to repair every tile and every section of the wall. When Mumu Ju saw that I was not complying, she adopted an awkward tone, saying that if I refused the repairs, I should at least allow them to leave the materials. I raised an eyebrow and gave a cold smile. Since when does one decide on renovations and announce them on the same day? Is there no sense of order left in this estate? Seeing Siyan about to lose her temper, I raised my hand to stop her. Just let them bring the items in. As expected, Mumu Ju ordered her subordinates to carry all sorts of things into the courtyard. Siyan looked at me in confusion. I gently shook my head, signaling her to be patient. I have possessed a keen sense of smell since childhood, and having traveled extensively with my father, I immediately recognized the smells from those jars. It was paint oil and dried pine resin, all highly flammable materials. I understood Madame Fu's intentions better than anyone. I hadn't even made my move, yet she couldn't resist striking first. That night, a gentle south wind blew. It was a moonless night, the beginning of the new month. A dark shadow slipped past the outside of the courtyard. In the blink of an eye, a fierce fire erupted, its glow spreading across half the sky. Strangely, although the roof had already begun to burn, only when the fire had engulfed half the courtyard did someone finally pretend to shout in horror, "Fire!" Seyan gripped my arm tightly, her face pale. The fire raged, and the intense heat washed over us, threatening to singe my hair. She whispered, her voice trembling, "Selena, they truly intend to burn us alive." At that exact moment, Madame Fu stumbled over, supported by Mumiju, crying out in anguish as she looked at the blaze from a distance. Save the girl. Oh, my poor, pitiful girl. Servants rushed into the courtyard with water, but the water had no effect on the fire. We only saw thick black smoke billowing, filling the gap between the courtyard wall and the wall of fire where Sayan and I were hiding. I was about to pull Sayan to safety upwind when she suddenly pointed. "My lady, isn't that the eldest young master?" I looked up. I saw a figure snatch a bucket of water, douse himself completely, and then charge straight into the courtyard without a moment's hesitation. My mind went blank. I screamed one name, Ronan. He was soaked to the skin, his body trembling slightly. I couldn't tell if it was from the cold or from fear. His eyes were locked on me, water running down his face like tears. "You! What are you doing?" I asked. My voice was hoarse. He raised his hand, but then let it fall, breathing out in relief. "It is good that you are unharmed. I thought you were inside." He couldn't finish his sentence before he began coughing violently from the smoke. I quickly supported him, pulling him back from the fire. Though his footing was steady, he did not let go of my hand. The fire wasn't extinguished until the constables from the capital prefecture arrived. The entire courtyard was burned to the ground, only the storehouse remained perfectly intact. Years ago, I had spent a large sum of silver to reinforce the walls with fireproof materials and line the roof tiles with an insulating layer. Looking back at it now, that silver was truly well spent. Mumuju had brought mostly paint oil and pine resin, all incredibly flammable. I knew instantly that Madame Fu intended to use fire to rob me, so I simply played along, using her own hands to set the stage for my counter-play. However, in this chess game, the one piece I never anticipated was Ronan. He had actually disregarded his own life, rushing into that inferno just to save me. After the fire, Ronan began to act strangely. Whenever my gaze happened to meet his, he would immediately look away. Yet, the moment I turned my back, he would secretly watch me, his gaze full of melancholy. I hadn't yet figured out how to soothe him when a summons arrived from the capital prefecture. A fire of that magnitude could not possibly escape the notice of the prefecture's arson investigation unit. This was precisely the pretext I was waiting for. When I arrived at the main hall, Madame Fu, the Marquis, and Alistair were already present. Madame Fu was weeping profusely, lamenting, "It is all my fault. I was too impatient. I worried the children would marry before the courtyard was properly repaired. I never imagined it would lead to such a disaster like this." Mumuju chimed in from the side. "Madam, how can you be blamed for this? A fire is just an unforeseen accident, is it not?" I smiled coldly, my gaze fixed on the pair. "Who said this was an accident?" Madame Fu's face turned pale. She visibly suppressed her rage, forcing herself to remain calm as she replied, "Selena, it was your aunt's negligent supervision that caused you this calamity. But the fire itself was truly an accident. How can you assign blame for it?" I turned, faced the uniformed arson official, bowed and declared solemnly, "This commoner saw the arsonist with my own eyes." The entire hall erupted in chaos. Mumuju shrieked, "That is impossible." "And why is it impossible?" I drew out my words, intentionally letting my gaze travel up and down Mumuju's entire frame. The arsonist was wearing a tight-sleeved jacket, identical to the outfit Mumuju is wearing today. Mumuju's face instantly drained of all color, and cold sweat poured down her back. She trembled as she argued, "It was a moonless night, pitch black. You couldn't even see your own hand. How could you possibly see another person's clothing so clearly?" A sharp cry rang out in the middle of the hall. I saw it clearly. A myna bird swooped in and dropped a dead mouse directly onto Mumuju's head. She shrieked and fell backward onto the ground, and a fire striker rolled out of her sleeve. Mumuju even carries a fire striker on her person," I remarked sarcastically. Mumuju scrambled to retrieve it, but a constable blocked her path. Madame Fu rushed forward to stand in front of the old servant, hissing at me, "Selena, do not make false accusations. If you have a grievance with me, there is no need to take it out on Mumuju. The elderly often wake during the night. Carrying a fire striker is perfectly normal." "Carrying a fire striker isn't strange," I agreed. I looked straight at Madame Fu, a cold smile on my lips. "Aunt, there is something you may not know. Tonight, my maid accidentally spilled a container of dye in my courtyard. This dye is incredibly persistent. If it gets on the sole of a shoe, it is nearly impossible to wash off. If Mumuju was by your side the entire evening, then let us examine the soles of her shoes, and all will be clear." Mumuju trembled violently, collapsing onto the floor. A constable moved forward, removed her shoe, and instantly revealed that the sole was covered all in the deep blue dye I had described. When the fire broke out tonight, Mumuju never set foot in my courtyard. So, I must ask, when did she step in that dye? Mumuju was speechless, unable to utter a single word of defense. The constables dragged her out like a lifeless body. Arson is a grievous crime. Even if it didn't warrant execution in the autumn, it meant banishment of at least 3,000 li. Madame Fu's face was deathly pale. She clutched her chest, muttering. The servant acted alone. It was not my intention, deflecting all responsibility. The arson official was a shrewd man. Having been slipped several banknotes by the Marquis, he nodded agreeably and declared the matter closed. This was all within my calculations. A noble madam would not easily be punished by the law. My true purpose was simply to gain a legitimate reason to move out of the Marquis's estate, and to send Mumuju to the execution ground. An arsonist who attempts murder must pay with blood. If she were not Madame Fu's most trusted confidante, why would she dare to undertake such a heavy crime? Therefore, the moment I guessed Madame Fu intended to commit arson and murder, the name that instantly came to my mind was Mumuju, the only one loyal enough to be her killer. As expected, Madame Fu's plot not only failed, but she also lost her devoted confidant of many years. Given her vindictive nature, she could never swallow this defeat. Soon enough, the renowned cosmetic shop operating under my name had its signboard smashed by Isabel's men. Following that, my Baolai Bank was hit with rumors of massive financial losses. Citizens flocked to withdraw their silver, nearly causing a catastrophic bank run. I was forced to sell assets at a loss, but my trade routes had already been secured to leverage new funds. They believed their retaliation would leave me devastated. But they fail to understand that for a true merchant, immediate losses are never a matter of survival. True revenge is striking a fatal blow from the bottom of the abyss. Just before the Kixi Festival, an opera titled, The Cuckoo Steals the Nest, suddenly gained immense popularity throughout the capital. This troupe did not charge for tickets. One only needed to purchase a single cup of tea to sit and listen for several acts. The lead performer's skillful singing, combined with the intricate and sorrowful plot, made it famous overnight, its reputation spreading through every street and alley. Just as the public was immersed in sorrow and sympathy for the story, a farmer led his entire family into the capital. Starting from the East Gate, he wept and chanted, kowtowing the entire way to the gates of the capital prefecture, recounting how his infant child had been stolen by nobles. His story, unexpectedly, matched the plot of The Cuckoo Steals the Nest, word for word. The citizens were in an uproar, shoving one another to get a look. This eventually forced the prefecture to hold a public hearing in the street, as they could no longer ignore the will of the people. The farmer knelt in the middle of the street, every word echoing. The ones who stole this commoner's child are from the Nanyang Marquisate. The second young master of that estate, Alistair, is my flesh and blood. The Marquis's estate, usually ignored, had recently gained prominence due to the marriage alliance with the general of Zhenhai. By the time the estate's family arrived at the prefecture, the streets were packed tight with onlookers. The Marquis, red-faced, angrily proclaimed his innocence. Slander. This is blatant slander. Behind him, Madame Fu and Alistair stood with grim, grey faces. The moment the old farmer saw Alistair, he became wild with joy, trying to lunge forward but was restrained by the constables. That is my son, my son. The magistrate of the capital prefecture slammed his gavel. Silence. You claim the second young master is your son. What evidence do you have? The farmer pulled forward two men, their skin tanned dark from working in the sun, and said, Your Excellency, just look at these two. What more evidence is needed? And indeed, though the two men were swarthy, their facial features were identical to Alistair's, as if cast from the same mold. It was obvious they were of the same bloodline, looking exactly like biological brothers. Was the proof not plain to see? I sat in the tea house, opposite the prefecture, listening as the little birds whispered a running commentary of the courtroom proceedings. Ronan was also present. While he couldn't understand the birds, he was the one who had gone to great lengths to find the old farmer. He knew the truth of this case better than anyone. That day, you asked me to detain Mumuju for a few days. It turns out you had already guessed the truth back then, I said. He had hidden it so well. He asked me, how did you discover it? I smiled, raised my teacup, took a sip, and replied slowly, by intuition. And by the ledgers. I used to think Madame Fu was just cold and heartless. But when I saw she treated Alistair with the same indifference, I truly believed she was incapable of affection. That lasted until Isabel entered the estate. Suddenly, my aunt became as gentle and warm as a spring breeze. It was only then I understood that she did know what warmth was. I had investigated the ledgers and discovered that every year, on Alistair's birthday, the Marquis's estate would secretly send expensive gifts to the south. A person's eyes can be deceived, but the silver in the ledgers never lies. Her heart was never truly in this estate. I tilted my hand, pouring the rest of the tea, onto the ground. This game was over. I stood at the edge of the crowd, quietly watching the Madam of the Marquisate being escorted away by the constables. Her hair was disheveled, her clothes in disarray, she retained none of the dignity of her station. When her gaze found mine in the crowd, her pupils contracted as if she had finally, at last, understood everything. Her lips trembled as she mouthed, "It was you." I did not reply. I only pursed my lips, mouthing back 2 words. "You deserved it." She screamed, struggling in desperation. "I am your blood aunt. How could you ruin me like this? Are you even worthy of your father?" I gave a cold laugh and walked, step by step, into the courtroom. Facing the murderous glare of Alistair, I clasped my hands and announced firmly, "Your Excellency, this case is not yet over. The Madam of the Marquisate and the General of Junhai, Yang Bunyan, once had an illicit affair. They produced an illegitimate daughter, Isabel, who was then secretly handed over to General Yang to raise. For all these years, Madame Fu has been secretly siphoning funds from the Marquis's estate to provide for her daughter. When General Yang Bunyan was investigated for illegally trafficking warhorses to cover his deficits, it was Madame Fu herself who devised the scheme to defraud my father of a massive sum of silver. She then had him assassinated to silence him. Today, I stand here to accuse them of murder, adultery, embezzlement, and conspiracy, and I demand justice for my father." At that, the entire hall fell deathly silent. The Marquis collapsed to the ground, his face sallow, looking as if he had aged a decade in that single moment. Madame Fu was trembling uncontrollably, shrieking. "I," replied succinctly. "General Yang Bunyan has had his assets seized, and his entire clan is facing execution. Is that not the clearest proof? What do you suppose Isabel's fate will be?" The moment those words left my lips, she began to shake violently, her eyes filled with absolute despair. "Isabel is innocent. She knows nothing." I gave a cold laugh. "Her innocence is not for you to determine. You used my father's blood money to support your lover and your illegitimate child. You tried to force me into concubinage for your false son to steal my dowry. When your schemes failed, you resorted to arson and murder. You are truly shameless, devoid of all conscience, and a disgrace to your ancestors. Karma will not spare you, and your daughter will have to bear the consequences." The case caused such a shock that the capital prefecture had to deliberate for a long time before finally delivering the sentence. The crimes were confirmed, and Madame Fu was sentenced to beheading after the autumn. Alistair, proven to be a descendant of the Tao family, was expelled and sent back to his ancestral village. The Marquis, for his gross negligence, was ordered to pay compensation to the farmer's family. On the day Alistair left the estate, he made a special detour to the villa where I was staying. He carried the kite he had made for me when we were young, weeping and begging to see me one last time. But I did not go out. He was not entirely a hero, but he was not entirely a villain. Perhaps he was just a weak person swept along by the currents of life. Although he did not strike the blow himself, he was, in the end, an accomplice. If I had not had the help of the birds, I dread to think what my fate might have been. I did not return his malice, not because I am a saint, but because I remember what my father taught me. A merchant's hands may hold gold and silver, but their heart must always retain compassion. After the southern flood disaster and the old case of General Yang Bunyan were settled, the Crown Prince Specially Lun summoned me to an audience. He smiled, saying, "Miss Selina, you are truly a heroine, righteous and brave. Because of your generous contributions, countless refugees in the south received aid. I wish to grant you a reward. You may ask for anything you desire." The Crown Prince was in his 30s, with a refined and scholarly bearing, his aura gentle yet extraordinary. As he spoke, his gaze drifted to the side where Ronan stood with his head bowed, blushing, not saying a word. I immediately knelt and kowtowed. "This commoner thanks your highness for bringing justice to my father and clearing his name. That blessing alone is enough. I dare not ask for more." The Crown Prince replied kindly, "Please, speak. Investigating the case was merely my duty, that cannot be considered your reward." I took a deep breath, clasped my hands, and touched my forehead to the floor. "Then, this commoner humbly requests that your highness establish a system of independent household registration for women, allowing women to conduct business in their own right, rather than being registered under the name of a man. The crown prince was momentarily stunned. He instinctively glanced at Ronan. Ronan still said nothing, but his lips pursed, the corners of his mouth threatening to smile. The crown prince then sighed. Alas, I had intended to act as a matchmaker, but it appears I was not given the opportunity. As for the matter you have requested, I will certainly see to it. After we left the palace, I suddenly felt ashamed regarding Ronan. He had done so much for me. Without him, I could never have avenged my father. Yet, in front of the crown prince, I mentioned no reward for him, driven only by my own desperate need for an independent household registration. I spoke quickly before he could say anything. That was selfish of me, I apologize to you. A flock of birds zipped around Ronan, chirping incessantly. It's over. The sickly man must think Selena wants to marry him immediately. Selena just wants to run her business. She doesn't care about marriage. I don't like sitting on eggs either. It's exhausting. Fine, I'll sit on them, all right. The little birds swarmed noisily around Ronan. He burst out laughing, helpless. It's almost as if they are truly speaking to me. One bird trilled. I told you so. This sickly one has been clever since he was small. Shh, be quiet. Selena's and the sickly one's marriage isn't even settled. Hearing this, I was suddenly reminded of the crown prince's words. I had intended to act as a matchmaker. My face flushed hot. But my life is still long, and there are many good days ahead. If you are willing to wait, I am willing to walk this path slowly, together with you. Ronan looked at me, his eyes gentle. A small bird landed softly on his outstretched hand. The tiny, bead-like eyes of the birds and his tender gaze all focused on me at the same moment. I thought to myself, autumn truly is the season of auspicious days. The story ends here for now. If it touched your heart or left you thinking, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Please like, subscribe,